What's up, hobby friends? I've gotten a lot of questions on the techniques and materials and how I make the little robots for my Caribbean Overlords. And so in this video, I'm going to be covering how my process or what my process is for making these cute little robots. So the primary building material that we're going to be using is Super-Sculpey Firm. Now, I like this material because it doesn't air dry. You have to actually bake it in the oven to get it to fully cure. What that allows us to do is to basically continually work or rework the body or the main part of the robot without being in any sort of a hurry. And we can keep shaping it and reshaping it. And then only once we're happy do we then need to go and bake it in the oven to fully cure it. What's cool about Super-Sculpey as well is that you can keep baking. There's no limit to the number of times you can bake it in the oven. So you can make a part of the robot, sort of the core, bake it, layer more Sculpey on top, and keep baking it. And there's no real negative or downside to doing so. Now, for the purpose of this tutorial, because I'm making a couple of tiny robots similar to my Arkanauts, which are simpler and not as layered, we're just going to do a once bake, a simple body shape. If you do layer on multiple layers of Super-Sculpey, I do recommend using something like liquid Sculpey as an adhesive, because non-cured Super-Sculpey does not adhere well to cured Super-Sculpey. So that's something to keep in mind. Some of the other tools that we're going to be using, I have a palette knife to help me do some of the line work and shaping of the robots. And then we're also going to be using a couple of clay sculpting tools. They have these rubber pads on the end. They come in a variety of shapes and sizes. And then they have these little nubs that we use for creating eye holes and sockets. It's also handy to keep outside some of the bases that you want the models to be going on. And this is more just as a size reference. So as you're making the body, you want to make sure that it fits appropriately on the base without being too small or too big. So for this video, I'm going to be making two robots, one with a square body shape that's going to be floating, very similar to this engine rigger. And then we're also going to make a cylindrical round body shape similar to this guy. And the reason is because I have a couple of Arkanauts models, the robots I'm not exactly happy with, and I want to replace them. I really like these body shapes, and they're one of the simpler ones to do. And I figured that'd be a good place to start to teach you or show you my techniques. Most of my Arkanauts are also on foot. I think I'm actually going to make the square body one floating, very similar to this. So to start, we're just going to take some Sculpey and we're going to break off just a few chunks and then knead them together to really work them and get them soft and malleable. Although Super-Sculpey doesn't really have a quote-unquote expiry date, exposure to air does dry out the material. So when you're not using it or when you're storing it, I do recommend you put it or keep it in an airtight container. I just use a freezer Ziploc bag that I store the Super-Sculpey in. Make sure that the air has been pulled out or closed out of the bag. Over time, you will find that if the Super-Sculpey dries, it will become a little more brittle and flaky, but you can just mix in a bit of water to help rehydrate it if necessary. Something to also keep in mind when you are mixing or you're kneading chunks of this Sculpey together, that you want to really work the material. If you're creating your shapes and there's too many of these cracks or layers in the Super-Sculpey, when you bake it, it's not going to expand too much, but as it hardens, the material can become a little brittle when you're going to do things like drilling or pinning. So in the case of my engine riggers, for example, when I drill into the bodies to insert these rods, I want to make sure that the body of the model is super mixed together without any of these cracks or air holes in them. It's air pockets. Otherwise, the material will split and the piece will break. This is something of particular concern when you're doing some of the smaller pieces. For example, on these arms, these hands, the balls are also made with Super-Sculpey, and splitting is more prone or more frequent in these smaller pieces. because a simple tiny crack will split the entire piece open, whereas on something bigger, on a body like this, a smaller crack somewhere might not necessarily be enough to split the entire model in half. Just something to keep in mind. So you can see that as I am working the material, it's getting softer and softer and easier to work with. And you can see just how easy it really is, or how soft the material really is, once it gets warmed up. It's very easy to shape and work with Super-Sculpey, and it's one of the reasons why I love working with this material so much. The white sheet of paper I have here is just a sheet of wax paper or parchment paper used for baking. My cutting board has a lot of marks, scuffs, and just general debris and cat hair that, while I try and keep clean, it's difficult to keep 100%. And so I like having this parchment paper just to sit down. It's a clean surface. It's non-stick, and so it's not going to leave a mark on the Super-Sculpey. It's I can lift the Sculpey off easily without any sort of sticking and pulling, and it'll also be useful to transfer when we go to actually bake the Sculpey. I can just take this entire sheet on a tray and bring it to the oven without having to touch it with my fingers afterwards. It's another thing with fingerprints on this material. Super-Sculpey dries very firm, and so you can sand off a lot of the surface imperfections in terms of like fingerprints. I'm not usually too worried about the prints, just because as I handle it, as I'm shaping it, using the tools and using the surface of the table, it ends up removing most of the prints anyways. Okay, so with the Super-Sculpey well kneaded and well worked, we're going to start working on the basic body shapes. So we're going to start with the box robot first. So similar to this. So we're going to start by creating the body for this, and then we need to make two pieces for the hands. Take a piece of the Sculpey. We don't want the box to be too big because, unlike the end riggers, which are on 32mm bases, the Arkanauts are only on 25. So we don't want it to be terribly large, and it helps to create a separation or a gap between the two different types of units, so it's very clear what's what. So I've taken the Sculpey and I'm just using my fingers to very roughly start to create my box. And you see I'm just twisting and rotating it, just firmly compressing until I have a rough shape of a square. You want to make sure that you're not pressing or pinching too deep on the centers, because you'll end up creating these divots. You want to create a more of the pressure along the edges, so you can roll your fingers if it helps. And I'm just rotating it along both the X, Y, and Z axes just to help to cover up the fingerprints just by constantly pressing it, and also to continually shape towards a cube without rounding any corners or ending up like a rectangle. It's also at this point that I also use the table as a flat surface to help finalize the edges of this body. And this is where the wax paper really helps, because it's so non-stick. It's very easy just to lift and roll the piece of Super-Sculpey. And the smoothness of the paper helps us avoid imprinting any marks or imperfections of our table surface. And that's our cube body. Any like minute imperfections, I'm either going to keep in the painting phase as sort of authentic battle damage, or I'll go back in with some fine grit sandpaper once I've baked this material and just correct or sand smooth. Okay, so that was very quick, very simple. We're not going to do a check of the size before we actually dive into making any of the details. So I have a couple of other Arkanauts here, and we're just going to bring them side by side to compare. And just to see if the cube is of an appropriate size or shape compared to some of the rest of the robots. Because this robot doesn't really have arms to the side and legs underneath. It's a hovering robot. The body is really the main focus, and so I can afford for it to be a little bigger comparative to the base. Now, looking at this one, I feel like the body is a little too small for what I want to use it for. So I'm just going to go ahead and actually quickly remake this by adding a bit more material. Because we're adding it to the existing cube, we need to rened and remash up the Sculpey just to help mix everything together smoothly. And then we just repeat the process, that same process of shaping the cube. I think it's an appropriate size. And it's not quite as big as the engine rigger, so that's okay. So once again, we're rolling the cube in our fingers just to get the basic shape of the square, compressing down all the sides. Now for this particular army, because I want the materials and the metals to be more derelict, more scrappy, more junky, I've avoided having too many sharp corners and perfect right angles. I've sculpted all of my robots with a bit more roundness to them. I feel like it adds to the caricature of the, I guess, the sculpt or the personality of the robot. And these imperfections make the entire thing feel less mass-produced or manufactured in a sense. If you really want the sharp corners though, you just pay more attention, be more careful when you're in the shaping step, and then you'll have to do a bit more work sanding once you've cured the robot. Okay, so with the body done, we're going to make the arms. And to make the arms, we're just rolling two little sausages with the Sculpey. I'm just doing a size comparison. For proportion, I feel like that's a pretty fun size. Yeah, that's a good size. And we're going to repeat the process for the second arm. So on this robot, I use bits and pieces for the lens. That's not something that we sculpt in this initial phase. We're not going to worry about that. But you will notice that there is sort of a line that acts almost like a mouth, or in my mind, it's the head twisting. And it just runs across the entire, around the entire body. Now to do that line, we're going to need to use our palette knife, and we're going to add it to the body before we bake it. It's much easier to carve it in and sculpt it in now before curing the Super-Sculpey. So to do that, we're going to pick a side of our robot. That's going to be the bottom. We're just going to do this side right here. Now, what I like about the palette knife is it's not sharp enough to be an X-Acto blade or to cut like an X-Acto blade. And so the line isn't going to be super fine, but it's not too thick where it's going to emboss or like really compress the material as we press. It's just sharp enough to leave a nice fine line without any issue. So we're just going to carefully press our line in. We're going to lightly mark and go around the entire body, just to very roughly place where the line's going to be. And we want to make sure that it's level across all 4 sides. You can see I've lightly marked or imprinted where it's going to be. This one we just go back in a couple more times, just very gently and very slowly, increase the depth to where we want it. And then we're going to add some teeth. I think I'm going to put the eye on the left side for this one, over here. So we're just going to use the point of our palette knife. I think 2's good. Okay. And then we're just going to quickly roll it across to re-flatten or re-correct the edges. And that's the body for this robot done. So to make a round-bodied robot is pretty much the same process. We're going to start with making a cylinder or a tube for the body. Because I want to have arms and legs for this one, we're not going to make the torso as big as this one compared to the base. We want to make sure that there's enough room for the model to sit comfortably on a 25mm base without overcrowding it. You can see on these existing Arkanauts that the bodies are actually pretty tiny, pretty wee compared to the base. So the hardest part about making the cylinder bodies is because as I'm rolling it across the wax paper, it naturally pushes out the sides, outwards to the edges, and it creates a divot in the center of both ends. So I usually end up, if I can't get it right on the sculpting phase, having to sand down the tops to flatten it. Which isn't a big deal, it's just a little extra step that we have to worry about. I think that's probably as good as we're going to get it for this one. So we have the body shape for this one. Going to be a squat little cylinder, and in my mind, I want to give him hands like this guy, little ball fists. And we'll probably give him feet. I have a bunch of Necron legs. So maybe feet, not similar to this, but using bits of Necron legs to create feet or legs. I think that'll be a cute little combination. So much like the square body, we're going to start by creating the mouth and eyes. And for this one, instead of using a lens, we're going to be using our sculpting tools to use the point of the dip to create the socket for them. So we'll start by using the palette knife. I'm going to pick the flatter side to be the top. I'm going to use the palette knife to just roll across and create our mouth line. I want it fairly close to the bottom. We'll just gently and slowly roll it across without putting too much pressure. Too much pressure and we may end up flattening our cylinder shape. Now we lightly roll the line across because it's easy to correct if I find that the lines end up being wonky or they don't line up. we can use a rubber sculpting tool, something like this, to just gently brush over to correct a line. So what I mean is, when the line's deep, it's much harder to correct. But something gentle like this, if I don't like this line where I want to correct it, and we just gently brush the tool across, and it helps to correct and hide that mark. Something like this, that's a little deeper, becomes harder to correct without too much pressure, and it may end up negatively affecting our shape. So when you make the initial line, you want to be gentle. Make sure that you get the line correctly placed first, and then go back in a second or third time to correct and make it deeper. Okay, so now that we have the body, we want to put or want to think about where the eyes are going to be. I think I want kind of beady little eyes, and I want them close together. You can go wide, you can go close. It's really up to you. You can be creative with this process. We're just going to gently press in a divot. And that's our first eye. Be the same, and we get our second. Now, it's at this point that we have to start thinking about how we're attaching the arms and attaching limbs. Now, the legs, because it's going to be a flat bottom, I don't have to worry about it. But the arms, I want a pseudo ball and socket, something that I can attach a pin or a paper clip to create the shoulder. So for something like this, for example, I put in a bit of a divot on the side of the body, and then I actually used brown stuff to create the shoulder, simply because I wouldn't have been able to drill into it. Sculpey at this size, I find, no matter how well it's mixed together, always splits. So I create a socket, and then I can just create a ball with brown stuff to use as my shoulder to then pin into. And that's one of the things that's nice to think about preemptively as you're sculpting it. It's much easier to do at this phase than to have to go back in afterwards and try and carve in the hole once the Sculpey has been baked. Right. So I think I'm going to put the arms at about the height of the eyes. We're just using a bigger nub. Just very lightly carving a socket or a divot for the shoulder. Now, it doesn't have to be too deep. It's just something for us to glue a ball of brown stuff into. And we want to mirror it on the other side, making sure that it's relatively symmetrical. And that's our body. Now, because I'm thinking in terms of painting, normally I would put lines similar to this square body to simulate teeth, but I really like the way this skull turned out, and I want to paint something similar on this body. So I'm not going to actually do teeth. Not on the front, because the skull will have teeth. You can put little lines on the side for venting, like I did in this one, but I think I'm going to keep this body simple, no vents. So we're going to set that body aside and we're going to create 2 quick balls for the fists. Those are big, too punchy. I think proportionally that's a good size. I'm pretty happy with those. So the next step is to bake our Sculpey. The instructions say to bake it for 15 minutes at 275 degrees Fahrenheit for every 1/4 inch or 6 millimeters of thickness and material. And this works well for really big ovens where the heating material, the heating conductors aren't so close. I like using a toaster oven because it is smaller, it heats up faster, and the process is much easier. Unfortunately, on a toaster this size, the heating material or the heat conductors are very close, and I found that 275 is too hot. It ends up scorching black and sometimes melting smaller pieces of Sculpey. And you can adjust the temperature. They recommend for every 5 to 10 degrees of a decrease to double your baking time. So what we're going to do, I found personal preference on this toaster is that 250 degrees is a perfect temperature. And so we're going to bake it for about 30 minutes. And then once that's done, let it cool off, which shouldn't take more than like 30 minutes or an hour. And then we'll get back to putting our robots together. Okay, so the Sculpey, after baking and letting it fully cool down for about an hour, has now fully hardened. We can see that unfortunately there was a bit of dipping on the top and some of the sides. So we're just going to take some sandpaper to file this down. And we're going to do the same thing for the tops and bottoms of the hands of this robot, as well as the top of the body of this robot as well. And then we're going to go one at a time, building each one in turn. Before I get to sanding, you can see that I've gathered some extra pieces and parts for the robots I want to build. So for the legs, I've gathered a pair of Necron warrior legs. I have an antenna in there somewhere. And I also pre-made some balls with brown stuff for the shoulder pads, or for the shoulders of this model. So we have those that we're going to use as well. And for this robot, we have, trawling through my bits bin, an antenna backpack from, I think, the Mechanicus Scutari, and a lens I don't know where. So all these parts have been cleaned and prepped to glue on just to speed up the process. I've also prepped some bases. You can see that I've used some clear rod for the flying stand of this base. I'm not sure about the exact height of this, so I haven't glued it on the stand yet. But once we glue everything on, including the arms, and we drill the hole for the stand, we'll be able to gauge exactly how high we want the model to be. And then magnets, of course, because I magnetize all the bases on my models. So we're going to start with the floating robot. And first thing we're going to do is we're going to get some sandpaper. I'm using two 400 and 600 grit, and these are wet sandpapers, so you actually use water, and it'll help to reduce the mess and the powders from the sanding process. Put a bit of water on there. Now, I like wet sanding because it helps to keep the powders from the Sculpey from flying everywhere, because we do have a lot of animals, and I don't want them or myself inhaling this. It also helps to make it easier to clean up afterwards. And as you sand with the water, it becomes a bit of a paste, and it's very easy to wash off or just wipe down. Okay, so with the pieces sanded down, we're going to start by building the floating robot. So the first thing I want to do is figure out where I'm going to put the arms. So like this robot, you can see I put the arms sort of in the back. It's allowed me to put this clear stand more central to the body. And I think I like this proportion, so I'm just going to do that again. So the first thing I want to do is pick the right gauge of wire to use for the actual arms to get the right thickness I want. And this is more just a proportion thing. You're sort of just testing and just playing around, see what you like, what you don't. I definitely think the thicker gauge is better. Okay. I'm just using a pair of metal clippers or clippers designed to cut metal just to trim down the edge and cut an approximate length for what I want. And don't forget to account for the fact that you are drilling into the model, so you're going to lose a bit of that depth. But if it's too long, don't worry, we can always trim it back afterwards. Once we have the wire gauge cut out, we need to then pin both of these to the hands or to the arms. You can see as I'm drilling into this material, it's no different than drilling into plastic. It cores pretty easily, so just be careful not to drill too deep unless you've already accounted for the depth. We just need enough to be able to glue the brass rod in. It's a touch of super glue. Give that a couple seconds to cure, and then we repeat the process for the other arm. While those are drying, I'm going to get some Plasticard to create both the barrels that go on the ends of the hands, as well as the trimming for the tops and bottoms of the flexible part of the arm. So because I don't have Plasticard that's cored out to match the diameter of the brass rod, I'm just going to take one that's the appropriate right size, using the same drill bit. I'm just going to core out the inside. And we need 4 of these, or 4 pieces of these for the top and bottom. Now I'm just rolling the blade to score before I cut through, and I find this helps me make a straighter slice across the piece. I'm going to do a quick fit check. Cool. And then because I want the arms to be swaying back, I need to put a bit of a curve into the arm. So we're just going to use the round pliers that we have, and we're just going to gently put in a bit of a curve. Nothing too big. And before we attach the arms to the body, we want to make the barrels of the guns. So I'm going to use this thinner rod for the internal barrel. And I think that telescopes well into this bigger piece. So we're going to score, and then just a bit of pressure to push through and cut. And then we're going to cut this at a slightly wider width at the outside one. I was using my hobby knife right now to trim the edge a little bit just to get it flat and a little more even. Okay, once we're happy with the piece, we're just going to use some super glue and affix it to the model. So once the outer ring has been glued on, we then tweeze in the inner ring or the inner piece. I'm going to set that aside to dry while we repeat on the other arm. While those are drying, we're going to drill the receiving holes on the body for the arms. So we want them on the back, spaced fairly evenly, and to help guide my pin vise, I'm just going to use a Sharpie actually. And make sure that I leave enough room for the width of both of the arms. Now we double check the fit as well as the proportions. We're checking the length of the arms, whether the arms are twisted or bent enough. I think one of these can be pulled back a little further. Like this one. Yeah, I think this one. It ends up being a good length. We're going to compare it to some of the existing Arkanauts. It'll be a little taller, but not a big deal, not significantly. I think it's still cool, and it'll still be shorter than an engine rigger, so a nice point of differentiation between the two. So before we glue on these arms, we need to make sure that we slide in the upper trim. So what we're going to do is we're going to glue the arm in first, And then while there's still a bit of super glue on the end, we're just going to slide the trim back up so that it's flush with the body. Okay, so while there's still a bit of super glue on the top there, we're just going to, boom, slam that trim down. Before I glue the rest of the pieces on the model, I'm just going to quickly drill out the bottom so that I can mount the model on the flying stand. There you go, a little flying beep boop. Now all that's left is to glue on these other two bits, and this robot is done. And that's the little robot done. A baby version of this, more in line with this. Now I like to patchwork a lot of my robots, and especially there's just adding extra panels as a way of injecting a bit of color as well on the model. And I think what I want to do is I want to put something on top. All right, so I've got this cool textured Plasticard. It's got this cool, I don't know, industrial steel texture on it. I've really enjoyed using this texture on this army. I'm going to cut something approximately to shape. Maybe a little less square. And then I like to round out the corners a little bit, so we're just going to take our 600 grit sandpaper, and we're just going to gently sand the corners away. Not too much. I don't like the sharp edges of it. I think a little roundness just makes it look a little nicer. You can skip this step if you want. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and glue that in place. And there's also a good way to either hide imperfections, or in the case of some of my robots where I've ended up actually with funny cracks and these like marks and stuff, to patch up the damage, as it were, to cover the mistakes and to also just add a bit of that ramshackle look to it. And then the last step we're going to do is we're going to add some rivets. And I think for the fourth corner, instead of putting a rivet in there, I'm going to put a hole. So it's like it's supposed to receive a rivet, but they either forgot or just got lazy, ran out of bolts maybe. There you have it. That's one floating robot done. To do our second robot, there's a little more prep work involved. And the first is to get the right height for the legs on. I'm actually going to use the Necron legs from the knee down to the foot. I'm going to use the shin plate and the knee as the thigh and knee. I'm going to get rid of this lower portion right here and then pin it to the foot. So first things first. So the next step is we actually want to pin the thighs. We want to have a paper clip running through the entire thing down to the bottom so that we can actually pin the feet to create the full leg, as well as pin this to the body, because this alone isn't a strong enough contact point. Now, when I say pin through, you can run a solid pin all the way through, or you can just have a separate pin on both ends. It's really up to you. Now, I don't know how long I'm going to have the legs, so I'm just going to make sure that there's enough on both ends where I can pin the foot and attach to the body. Set that aside and repeat the process for the other leg. So now I'm just adjusting the angle of the pin because I accidentally pinned it and the rod went too far of an angle. But that's okay. So we're just making this up as we go. Okay, so now we need to eyeball, give or take, how tall we want to make the leg. So the first thing I'm going to do actually is drill the 2 holes for the feet, and we can start dry fitting. So that feels a little too tall for me, so I'm going to trim off a little bit of this, this pin. And you don't want to trim too much, just a little bit. Ooh, that's nice. Yeah, that's an excellent height, I think. So we're going to glue that in, and that's our right leg done. We're going to let that dry while we go ahead and pin the other leg. Just comparing this leg side by side to see how much shorter we have to make it. And while that leg's drying, we're going to approximate where we want the legs to attach. There and there, I think. Closer to the Okay, and I'm pretty happy with that. So what we're going to do is we're going to glue it in one leg at a time, making sure that once the legs are in, that they're standing flat on the ground. And at this point, we're also going to attach him to his base. Standing just a little further back because he is in a leaning forward pose, and I want his arms to be a little in front. We're almost there. Just gotta do the arms. The first thing we're gonna do is glue in these shoulder balls. And you can see having pre-made the sockets before baking the model makes it much easier to position and glue these balls in. And at this point, I also have an antenna that I want to put on him. So we're just going to go ahead and attach that as well. It's pretty good. We're going to do his arms in very much the same way that we did the arms of this robot. We're going to need some wire gauge for the extending bendy bit, and then we're probably going to use I would say some Plasticard trim to attach the fists to the arm. I don't think we need it for the shoulder though. And we need to pick a gauge that's going to be proportional for the fist as well as for the shoulder. And I think this gold one might be a little too heavy. So I think we're going to end up using paper clip for our wire. That's the first thing we're going to do. Is drill a receiving end in each fist and glue in our wire. Now, because I can't drill too far into the shoulder, it's fairly easy for me to estimate the length. Holy moly, these are big fists. But you know what, that's okay. I'm okay with a little goofy proportion. I think we'll go right there. And then we'll do the same thing for the other fist. And then for the trim, so we're going to use this Plasticard tubing. It is not cored on the inside, it's a solid piece, so I'm going to have to pre-drill. But that's okay. Making sure it's relatively in the center. I just want to add a bit of a curve to the arm, just so it feels a little less stiff. I can pose them a little more naturally. And then we're going to go ahead and drill the receiving holes into the shoulders. And the last thing we're going to want to do is make some fingers for this little guy. To do that, we're just going to use a super thin piece of Plasticard. You don't want the fingers to be too long. I usually go for 1 to 2 millimeters. But it depends. I like exaggerating the features on these models, pairing a lot of things that don't feel like they should fit together. So big hands, small fingers, really thin arms, big chunky body, short legs. Again, it's about creating that caricature of the figure. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And that's robot number 2 completed. And that's pretty much it. You can see that the process, while a little lengthy in terms of time, a lot of it is more just preparation, planning, and a lot of waiting, especially when you're baking the pieces and letting things like brown stuff cure. But the overall process itself is actually very simple, very straightforward. And that was by design, by intention. I wanted these models to be very simple, very minimal, and it would also make them much easier to paint. And really a lot of the effort, I guess, comes in from the creativity of being able to mix and match a lot of these simple shapes, a lot of these basic shapes to create these very cool, characterized, almost infantile like robots, which are a lot of fun to make. I do apologize for the length of the video. I wanted to show the entire process from front to back, and they're not easy models to make in terms of time. They do take a little bit of effort, but I think the end result is definitely worth it. So if you enjoyed the video, give it a like, and don't forget to subscribe for more weekly content, and follow my Instagram at John the Ho for daily updates on my hobby content. Until next time, happy hobbying.